We're here in a gloriously sunny Hamble with Motorboat Yachting to do a used boat report on the Atlantic 460, this one dating from 2005. First though, I'd like to thank you all for the tsunami of feedback from my very first video, all very much appreciated. Those of you who said my microphone was crackly and generally rubbish were quite correct. Hopefully you'll be pleased to know that it's actually faulty and that I now have a new and much more expensive one, which I hope works better. And apologies if your tinnitus hasn't yet disappeared. With all that feedback in mind, we're going to try something different this time. So the idea is to keep all the things you said you liked and then add the things that you say you missed. In particular, the sort of single continuous walk around that you quite rightly explained gives you a better idea how all the spaces hang together. I'm also going to add a section at the end about running costs. So here goes. We're actually covering two boats at the same time here, the Atlantic 460, which we're standing on, and the Atlantic 444. And that's because they're essentially the same boats with different engines. So the 460 we have here has twin 480 horsepower Volvo TAMD 75Ps, top speed of around 26 knots, and the 444 models had 370 horsepower Volvo TAMD 63Ps, and I got a top speed of 24 knots when I tested a 444 back in 1998. So we're heading into the cockpit now. So it's a single raised helm with aft deck seating and steps down to a smallish bathing platform, not the sort of giant platforms that you find on boats today, although obviously extending that isn't a difficult thing to do. And if we move back through the cockpit, we're heading down below now, down a few stairs into this area. Now we're in the area now that is the heart and soul of the 460 and the 444, and it's really what makes this boat so flipping good. It's a single expansive open plan area, so we've got the dinette down here and the galley opposite, just down a few steps really, and then swinging back here we've got this saloon proper, and then it's just a few quick steps up to the aft cockpit. And the great advantage of this layout is that it's very sociable for a couple or two couples cruising. No one's ever far away from anybody else. Communication is really good, so a very sort of sociable boat. However, when bedtime comes, the great advantage of this boat again is that we've got a private aft cabin a few steps down here, and then at the opposite end of the boat we've got another private cabin. And the distance between the two front doors of these cabins is about 20 feet. If you were to try and find a single expansive saloon, galley, dinette arrangement on a typical flybridge boat, all in one space like this, open plan, with light flooding through these big windows, panoramic windows around the boat, you'd be looking at a flybridge boat probably of around 55 foot these days. Even with today's super voluminous flybridge cruisers, you'd want a really big boat to get the same sort of effect. So let's take a tour into the aft cabin, the owner's cabin, the master stateroom. So plenty of space in here, tons of storage. You just count the lockers over on that starboard side. Quite a good sized bed, escape hatch out to the bathing platform there, safety feature. Pretty good headroom, I would say. I'm sort of guessing at around maybe sort of 6'6" headroom, and again just stowage everywhere. Lockers here, another locker hidden behind this door, and then an ensuite heads. The big difference between this one and the one forward is it's slightly more spacious, and it has the advantage of its own separate shower stall, which is always a big plus, cleaning up things. And we go back up to the forward cabin. These steps hinge up to give you access into the back of the engine room, although to get to the engine room proper you have to move this table down into the galley and take up the carpet here and removed the engine floor panels, but we'll come back to that in more detail later. Some nice practical touches all the way through this boat. We've got fiddles running around almost all the countertops, either these solid metal fiddles which give you quite a nice sort of handhold, or little fiddles on the table, stop things rolling off. And then again, galley, loads of storage everywhere, and light flooding down through these big windows. Although the galley's down, and I'm not normally a fan of galley down layouts, this one just doesn't feel separated from the goings on up here because it's only a few steps away. More nice details, little rubber strips, non-slip strips on the steps here. Storage, just storage everywhere. Every nook and cranny in this boat has storage under the galley floor here. And then moving forward to the forward cabin, this is just a 2-cabin boat. Atlantic did build 1 or 2 boats with a tiny little sort of single berth space, if you like, tucked somewhere up round here, around the dinette, but the majority are 2-cabin boats, and this is very similar to the aft cabin, just a scaled down version in every regard. So still plenty of storage, slightly smaller bed, but still a reasonable size. Not quite as much headroom, but still pretty good. 6'3" at a guess, I would say. And the practical touches continue all the way through. Fiddles everywhere. Plenty of light, courtesy of the overhead hatch, and then back into the ensuite heads. This one not quite so large. This one has a sort of integrated shower, so you don't get a separate shower stall in this thing. There were Atlantic offered lots and lots of different finishes and would customize their boat to quite a high degree. So what you see here isn't necessarily what you would get if you went out looking for an Atlantic. Everything was up for grabs. So all sorts of timbers, cherry, pear, bird's eye maple, all sorts of stuff, pretty much anything you wanted. Bamboo, I saw a fantastic bamboo boat once, which was really quite startlingly classy. Completely kitted out with a lacy kitchenware. Looked really very classy indeed. And the fabrics as well, they were all up for grabs, so you could really have whatever you want. So if the style of this boat in terms of sort of decor doesn't suit you, don't think that if you go looking for an Atlantic this is what you're going to get, because you may get something entirely different. What you do get though is this single huge open plan space, which to my mind works so well. I find it's a very safe boat to be on board because the communication between the crew and the skipper is so good. So this is the other big deal for me, this single raised helm. So no inside helm, no elevated flybridge helm, just this single raised aft deck helm position. Now, numerous advantages really. One is that it's only a few quick steps down into the saloon there, so it's an easy descent, and also communication with people downstairs is much easier. And with all these canopies stripped off, it looks a bit sort of enclosed at the moment, but with all these canopies stripped off, you have a true open air experience that a flybridge boat has, and at the same time a better view than the sports cruiser helm from inside. And as you can see, the 460 has a really wide, very straightforward but good, practical, very expansive dash here, with all the instruments very easy to see, very easy to operate, space for a chart table, very clear switchgear down here. It's really a delight to drive from. And the big seat here, if everybody wants to rubberneck when you're underway, this is big enough for a commodious 3 or a cozy 4, no problem at all. The final bonus of the aft deck position is that with no flybridge you can engineer a hinging mast, and this drops down to give you an air draft of about 11 foot, which is 3.4 meters, and hey presto, the world of inland waterways cruising opens up to you. So a real dual purpose boat here. You just saw this big helm seat in what can only be described as the driving position, but Atlantic engineered a canny little arrangement, an electrically powered sliding seat. You can see I've moved it forward here, and it goes further forward still. Probably about 1.5 foot all told, and that opens up the cockpit space here. And there's loads of seating at the back here, certainly enough for 4, maybe a cosy 6 across the back, and then maybe 4 people here. The actual deck space is a bit sort of bijou, but that's partly because these seat squabs here are incredibly deep, probably about 4 or 5 inches deeper than you'll find in most cockpit seating areas. These are about normal, but still plenty of them. And also the owner has put this really big chunky table right in the middle of the space, and I think you could open out this space some more still by organising a sort of folding table which will give you alternatives. Like about 99% of the canopies I've ever seen on boats, the Atlantics are ugly both from the inside and the outside, but we shouldn't hold that against them because they're actually a pretty well designed and very versatile bunch of canopies. So we have the forward canopies here which adjoin the top of the screens and then tie in with the top of the radar arch. That's your sort of first line of defence when it gets a bit choppy. Then if the weather turns nastier still, there's another second set of canopies that adjoin the radar mast and come down to the floor. And then finally there's the complete sort of aft canopy, perimeter canopy running around the back of the boat here. But even those, they sort of mix and match. There are several sections you can either close down or roll up, and even these little sort of wing canopies here can be kept there or taken off, and the doors can be open or closed. So all told, actually a really well thought out set of canopies. It's actually quite instructive to wander around the deck of the Atlantic 460 because it gives us clues as to how sturdily built it is. Everything just seems that little bit larger than you might expect, although you maybe can't put your finger on it. However, as luck would have it, right next to us we have a Fairline Phantom 43, which is a well-built boat of the 2000 plus era, and as good as it was, the Atlantic is just that little bit chunkier. So we've got 30mm guardrails instead of the Phantom's 25, and we've got 2 sets of really sturdy spring cleats complete with the stainless steel rubbing strips there instead of the Phantom's 1, and sideboarding gates again with a sort of rubbing strip here, and then we've got this colossal polyethylene rubbing strake along the side backed with a stainless steel strip. Then we get to the bow and we've got fender baskets built in, and we've got a stainless steel anchor here, and a nice little touch I like is the pulpit has been truncated, so you're not going to be paying for 2 foot of pulpit poking out of your boat in the marina, because they do charge you for every inch, do they not? I'd like to tell you about the construction of this boat because although you can't see it, I just happen to have an intimate knowledge of the construction. So before I was seduced into the world of journalism with promises of testing glamorous boats in exotic places, I actually used to have a proper job designing boats. And at the very time the Atlantic was designed, in the late 80s, I had the tremendous good fortune to be working for John Bennett, the designer of this boat, and one of the most prolific motorboat designers of the 20th century. I didn't actually design this boat, John did. I was busy designing a 50-footer for Azimuth, and more pertinently the Broom 37 from that era. Now we used exactly the same construction in the Broom at the Atlantic. And the builders probably thought we were a pain in the arse because we specified the exact order that everything had to be laminated in place to maximise the strength of the system. So we insisted that all the longitudinal stringers was put in the boat and then laminated over before the big transverse frames were added over the top. Now you might be surprised, quite a few builders don't do that. They actually put all the foam structure in first and then laminate it over the whole thing. And that results in a much more discontinuous structure. Those longitudinal stringers are no longer continuous. They're actually just small segments sitting in between the big frames. And the difference in the strength is quite profound, the difference in the stiffness. So the Atlantic is actually, the 460, and all the Atlantics actually, are very sturdily built boats, very sound indeed. Now I know white fiberglass isn't particularly exciting to look at, but bear with me. What we're actually looking at, we're standing on the coach roof now, and we're looking at the emergency engine removal hatch, which John insisted on designing into all of his boats. Now that in itself, this sits just above the engine room, certainly close enough that you could get the end of a crane in there and crane the engines out if you ever needed to. Now this is significant for two reasons. One is if your engines ever needed major remedial work, they could be removed quite easily. But the other significant aspect is that we had a completely different engine mounting system to most builders or most designers. So the engines used to sit on these huge longitudinal metal girders that ran fore and aft and hung on the big transverse frames that ran at the front and the back of the engine room. And what this means is that if you ever had to re-engine a boat, even with completely different engines with different feet spacings and different feet heights and whatever, it would be a relatively easy task to either modify the metal beds or to simply have another pair of custom-made metal beds. So in the pantheon of old powerboats, there are probably no others you will come across that are easier to re-engine should you ever want to do that. And I've been lucky enough to have spent a little time cruising on these John Bennett designed aft cabin cruisers, Atlantics and Brooms, and it's a real joy to be able to shower and use the loo without ever disturbing your guests at the other end. Atlantic 460 owners are obliged to live with one fairly key compromise, and that is engine room access. We're in the aft cabin here, and you can get into the back of the engine room by lifting these heavy steps and then furtling around in here. We've got the generator on the left. You can see the port raw water strainer there, and then the starboard one there, and then the fuel filter there as well. And you can just about get to the gearbox dipstick from here. But if you want to get into the engine room proper, then you have to drop these heavy steps down and then you head up into the saloon proper. So the order of play here is that you have to lift the table from the starboard side and carry it down to the galley, and then you have to lift out the four engine room floor panels, 2 on the port side and 2 on the starboard side, and those are loose, they're not hinged on gas struts rather inconveniently. Then once you've done that, you have access into the engine room proper, but even then the access is pretty tight. This boat has wing tanks, and so the distance between the outboard edges of the engines and the inboard edges of the inboard faces of the tanks is pretty tight. You certainly couldn't get a human down there, at least not a normal size one. And you've got little bits of machinery here like fuel filters and blowers restricting that access. If you want to dive in between the engines to get to the dipsticks, then even that's a little bit tight. I've put my size 8 shoes there, give you an idea of the space available, but it's going to be a bit of a wriggle even for a slim Jim. And I know if this were my boat, the first thing I would do is just get rid of this whole mess, take out these ditch these engine room floor panels here, get rid of these 2 cross bearers, and then I would have a custom made carbon fibre skinned foam cord engine hatch made, which single hatch which fill this space, and then hinged along the back edge here, so you could just lift the whole thing up in one go, and then access to the engine room would actually be quite reasonable. You could jump down between the middle there, get to your dipsticks and sort of fettle your engines much more easily. I have some facts and figures here, so shall we talk about the vulgar subject of money? So these boats were in build from 1990 to 2006, and the acknowledged experts with Atlantic are Mike and Beryl Miller from Imperial Motor Yachts. They've been dealing with these boats for 3 decades, and they've sometimes followed a boat all the way through its life, several boats all the way through their lives. And in one case they've sold a boat 5 times, albeit to different owners of course. Now they reckon that the span of prices would range from about 150,000 at the bottom end to £295,000 at the top end for a newish boat, nearer 2006. So this particular boat is 2005, and this is for sale for £285,000. Now there is rare as hen's teeth, so this is the only one on the market at the moment. I did find 2 other Atlantics for sale at the time of writing, at the time of making this video. One is a 42, down in Falmouth with red ensign, and that's £190,000. Now the 42 is a very generically similar boat, more compact of course, but same basic layout, same raised aft deck, single helm position, same aft cabin, same midships engine room, and so on and so forth. So you can consider that out of the same sort of mould but slightly smaller. The only other boat I found was a 444. But when I contacted the brokers to ask them to feature the boat, I got a very polite reply saying, "Thank you very much, David, but we're not interested." So obviously that one's top secret and I can't tell you much about it. And I guess the only thing I could mention is that where it comes from, the people sometimes wear clogs. I'll say no more. Anyway, on to annual running costs. We've decided to swap the engine servicing costs, which we used to print in the magazine, and I was going to include here, for other costs instead, mooring, specifically mooring and annual fuel burn. Now after a lot of thought I decided to ditch the engine cost because I felt we're in danger of slightly misrepresenting or misleading you, or be slightly imprecise, for a variety of reasons. The fact is that engine service costs vary hugely depending on where the engine is in the cycle of its service life and how old it is as well. And the engine manufacturers are very reluctant to give us any hard and fast figures without a precise serial number for the engines, and I'm sort of with them there as well. And then there was the difficulty of stern drive leg boats. Do we include the cost of servicing the stern drive as well or not, or maybe every 2 years? And then outboards, of course, another dilemma. There are some outboards now which have no servicing costs for 5 years, so that would be difficult to factor in. And then with the big old diesels, of course, several boats are offered with a range of engines, but also from different manufacturers. Sometimes the big engine option is from a different manufacturer to the small engine option, and again that might produce a disparity in engine servicing costs, which are a bit misleading. So instead we're settling on annual mooring costs and fuel burn. So just taking the 444-460 model, when I tested the boat back in 1998, that was a 444 with the 370s, and we got a fuel burn of at 19 knots of 23 gallons an hour. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read from this, or 105 litres per hour. So that would give us a range of 260 miles with the 1,800 litre standard fuel tank capacity, with the 20% reserve that we normally allow here. So 50 hours cruising, which Volvo and pretty much everybody else tells us is the annual average UK cruising hours that we do, is 50 hours. So 50 hours at 19 knots would consume around 5,230 litres. Now that's with the smaller engines, but I wouldn't expect the bigger engines to consume any more fuel. The amount of energy needed to propel a boat at any given speed, 19 knots in this instance, doesn't really vary. So the big engines, they might consume a little bit more fuel because they weigh an extra 424 kilos if you take the two of them, but it's going to be really marginal. So moving on to mooring costs, we're going to base that on mooring in the Solent area for all the boats we do from now on. So this boat, which is 14 metres dead, 46 foot dead, that would cost between £11,500 and £22,500 including VAT. So that completes the grand tour of the Atlantic 460. It's not the most glamorous boat on the outside, but it can be very glamorous inside. It doesn't have a huge flybridge strewn with sunbeds, but it does have this fantastic raised helm position aft. And I think as a comfy cruiser for two couples or one couple, it's a consummate performer.